Good morning. I'm Catherine Wilkins, Deputy Director of the Middle East Program here at the Carnegie Endowment, and I want to welcome you all to this all-day conference this morning. The topic is ISIS and the shifting geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. The Islamic State and the Levant leapt into public and international consciousness earlier this year with the horrible beheadings of Western journalists. Since that time, the public debate over the situation in the region has often tended to be oversimplified and focused on ISIS itself and the effort to degrade and destroy it. Today offers us all an opportunity to step back and look deeper at the complex dynamics in the region today and the forces and conditions that are shaping the political and security situation in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as the actions and the policies of neighboring countries in the region. We have an excellent group of Carnegie and regional speakers, experts speaking today. Our last session will be with Deputy National Security Advisor Antony Blinken. That session will begin promptly at 3 p.m., and anyone attending will be asked to remain seated until Mr. Blinken leaves the building. Finally, we have C-SPAN and a number of other news agencies filming the conference today. I ask you to please be conscious as you move around in the back of the room. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Marwan Mouasher, Vice President of Policy and Director of the Middle East Program, who will moderate our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for organizing this conference at such a timely time. The reason we were late, and I'm sorry we are a bit, is because we just stepped out of a meeting in which our President, Jessica Matthews, announced that she would be stepping down after 18 years of service and of leading the Carnegie Endowment to where it is today, offering a unique global vision, and that Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns is going to succeed her on February 4th. So I thought I would share the news with you. Okay, so our panel this morning will focus on Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Kurds. And while we have included the Islamic State in the title of this session, we want to go well beyond the Islamic State and consider the local roots of the current fragmentation and violence in these countries, as well as the challenges posed by the rising influence of non-state actors, including radical Islamist groups such as ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and others. Our focus will be on understanding the key factors influencing the political and security dynamics in these countries and the likely impact of the international coalition's engagement in the region. Finally, we will also examine the dynamics between the Kurdish regional government and Baghdad, as well as shifting relations between different Kurdish groups, including the PKK and Syrian and Iraqi Kurdish factions, and implications for the region. I'm very pleased to have with me an extremely strong group of panelists this morning. They include our own Yazid Saigh, Senior Associate at the Carnegie Middle East Center, who will be joining us by video conference. I hope he's there. I can't see him from here. Yazid's research has focused on the dynamics of the Syrian conflict, the political role of Arab armies, and security sector transformation in the Arab world. We are also joined by al-khoei, an Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Haidar was formerly a researcher at the Center for Academic Shia Studies. His research has focused on Iraq, clerical authority in Shia Islam, and Middle Eastern history and politics. And to the far left is Denise Natalie, a Senior Fellow at the Defense National University here in Washington. Denise was formerly a researcher working in the Kurdish regions of Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Syria. She specializes on the Kurdish issue, regional energy security, and post-conflict state building. And finally, to my immediate left is Joseph Bahout, who has just joined us here in DC as a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment. He's a professor and researcher at Sciences Po in Paris and a research advisor at the Académie Diplomatique Internationale, a think tank based in Paris. Joe's research has focused primarily on Lebanon and Syria. With that, I'll turn the floor to Yazid from... Yazid, where are you? Are you in Beirut?
Yes, I am.
Good.
But I was actually... The sequence you had me in the agenda, which was last, so I'm going to ask you to stick to that if you could.
Sure. You want to be last?
Yeah, well, not first anyway.
That is fine. That is fine. I'm always afraid technology will not be helpful, and but hopefully it will be today, and we will keep Yazid with us till the end. So then, if that's okay with you, then we'll turn to Haidar al-Khoei.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Endowment for inviting me today. It's a great pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. I was invited today to address the situation in Iraq, the outlook for the new government, the efforts to disengage Sunnis from ISIS, and the role of Iran and the Shia militias. I'll start by saying Prime Minister Abadi is clearly making many steps in the right direction. Some of these have been symbolic. He's banned the use of his pictures in all government buildings, security checkpoints, military establishments, but others, such as dissolving the office of the Commander-in-Chief, are serious attempts to break away from Maliki's policies. Of course, many of you know that office was established by Maliki to bypass the military chain of command and move Iraqi army units without even the knowledge of the Ministry of Defense. Of course, the key security policy now Abadi is trying to push, and even some Shia partners are hesitant about, is this idea of the National Guard. It's one of the key demands of the Sunni Arabs, and Abadi is serious about establishing and standing up these armies. It's clear that the Sunni Arabs will no longer tolerate central government forces, especially sectarian Iraqi soldiers who man checkpoints and control security. So the proposed bill of the National Guard would not just draw up soldiers to protect the provinces, but the key aspect is that the commanders of these forces will be local commanders. Now, of course, this is, I believe, a short-term solution, a necessary one, to empower Sunnis to push back against ISIS. But it could very well be a serious problem in the future, especially if there are cross-provincial security incidents, as we've seen over the last years. For example, if militants cross Anbar into Karbala, and conduct terrorist operations, it won't just be groups facing each other, but in effect many armies, a Sunni army versus a Shia army. And it's not clear how the central government is going to react or even control these units, because they will be answerable to the governor. And of course, as with everything else in Iraq, the devil is in the details. Who makes up the units in the Sunni provinces, and of course, who makes up the units in the Shia provinces? Will it be conscription? Will it be Shia militias? Will it be Sunni militants who will turn against ISIS? None of this is clear. As a concept, everybody now seems to have agreed on the National Guard, but the details have yet to be worked out. I also just want to mention Abadi is very different to Maliki in terms of his leadership style, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be successful. So friends of Abadi who have worked for decades with him say he's the exact opposite of Maliki. Though he comes from the same context, the same party, the same Islamist sort of conspiratorial, paranoid background, he's much more open than Maliki, and this could be his downfall as well. Where Maliki was stubborn, refused to listen to even his closest advisors, Abadi is seen to be too open. He listens too much. He wants everybody's opinion around the table, and is seen even by some of his friends as indecisive. Maybe the office of the prime ministership is going to force him to react, but this is definitely something to watch out for. I also want to say it's interesting that Abadi is the first Iraqi prime minister since Iyad Allawi who isn't the preferred candidate of Iran. Iran, up until the last minute, lobbied very aggressively to keep Maliki in power for a third term. And it wasn't actually the Americans or the Shia rivals or the Sunnis or ISIS or the Kurds. It was Ayatollah Sistani, the religious establishment in Najaf, which effectively blocked Iranian dreams of a third term. So we talk about Iranian influence in Iraq, but it's not a one-way street. I would just nuance that with saying that whatever leverage Iran lost because of that decision, they have more than made up due to the reliance of the Iraqi government on ideologically driven Shia militias. These are the militias who are holding the line, who are holding the lines on the outskirts of Baghdad. They prevented the fall of Samarra, which was crucial and remains crucial in preventing an all-out Sunni-Shia war. And of course, the militias spearhead and still spearhead the Iraqi army advances. I was in Baghdad on June the 10th when Mosul fell, and the contrast between how the Americans reacted and the Iranians reacted, I think, is going to have very long-term negative consequences on Iraq. So after the ISIS advance, Obama, he saw this as Bush's war, a country he'd rather ignore, very little engagement, at least serious engagement with Iraq. And even as ISIS was encroaching on the capital, the Americans, the Obama administration, kept signaling there needs to be political reform in exchange for military support. Now contrast this with the Iranians, who immediately mobilized. They stood up and sped up the mobilization of Shia militias. IRGC General Qasem Soleimani, within 24 hours, he could have already been in Baghdad, but within 24 hours, he was there. He was personally checking up on the checkpoints on the outskirts of Baghdad. The Iranians sent weapons to the Kurds, to the Shias, to the central government. They even sent back Iraqi fighter jets left over from the 91 war. So in other words, with ISIS advancing closer to Baghdad, the Americans dithered whilst the Iranians mobilized to essentially save Iraq. Earlier this month, I was in Tehran for a workshop in Iranian foreign policy organized by the European Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the meeting was held under the Chatham House rule, but one line we kept hearing was Iran saved Iraq whilst America failed to. And at the time, a senior Iraqi official told me, and I quote, "Both the US and Iran are our strategic allies, but Iran doesn't let its friends down in times of need." And this is why I say it will have long-term consequences, not just on how the Shia who dominate Baghdad view the Iranians, but how the Sunnis will continue to view the Shia-dominated government. And of course, this has been made worse with the recent appointment of a Badr politician as interior minister. Of course, Badr is a militia group that was created and supported by Iran, so it doesn't bode well for national unity prospects on Iraq. One thing I'd like to touch on during my initial remarks is one of the key shifts I've seen in the political discourse in Baghdad over the last few months. And it's been how the Shia masses have reacted to the ISIS crisis. We're all familiar with Sunni disenfranchisement, Kurdish frustration with the central government. But now the Shia themselves feel less committed to Iraq as a nation state. More and more Shia essentially see Iraq as an Iraq that runs between Baghdad and Basra, and to hell with the rest. There's an increasing sentiment, from Baghdad to the south. If the Kurds want to have Kirkuk, let them have it. Let them fight with the Sunni Arabs. If ISIS wants Anbar and Mosul and Salahuddin, let them fight with the Sunni tribes. It's not our problem. And of course, this is dangerous. It's a dangerous sentiment that it's not going to bode at all well for unity in Iraq. And the vast majority of Iraqi Shia know and understand that the vast majority of Iraq's wealth lies deep in the Shia south. ISIS may have a long arm, but it's not somewhere they can penetrate due to simple demographic reasons. So the Shia are confident that they can protect this Iraq, contain ISIS from this Iraq. And just to put this sentiment into context, it's worth remembering just 5 years ago, the only Shia political party that was pushing for a Shia state was the Islamic Council the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, and they were heavily punished by the Shia voters because they saw this as an Iranian plot to divide and control Iraq. Yet now today, 5 years later, given the rise of ISIS, more Shia are open to this idea. And it's not just a sentiment on the grassroots level. The very first press conference Abadi gave, it wasn't picked up, I think, by the international media. One key line he mentioned at the very end of his presser was, and I quote, "I will not be ready in the future to send units from the south to fight in Anbar. I want the people of Anbar to liberate Anbar, and I will support them." Now, of course, the backdrop to this is a widely held sentiment in the south of why are we dying in places like Anbar? Why are our sons being slaughtered and massacred in places like Tikrit? It isn't our problem, and we shouldn't be wasting resources, or we shouldn't be dying to save Sunni towns. And on that note, the key battle, I think, to watch out for is the coming Sunni-Sunni war over who controls the territory that now ISIS dominates. I do think it's only a matter of time before we see a showdown between the Ba'athists and the Islamists. And we did see signs of this after the initial Mosul advance. It was quickly settled swiftly by ISIS, which essentially killed anyone who stood in their way and assassinated key Ba'athist commanders. But given now that it seems the whole world is turning against ISIS, with the exception of perhaps Turkey, I don't think ISIS is going to sustain its supremacy in Sunni areas, at least in Iraq. As popular as they are now, I think the other insurgent groups will be able to sway local loyalties. And ISIS is already losing ground in Iraq. Also, ISIS may implode from within. I mean, it's no secret that many of the senior key military commanders are ex-Ba'athists. They're Ba'athists who served under Saddam Hussein's regime in key military and intelligence apparatuses. So the question I ask myself is, are we to believe that these hardcore, secular, pan-Arab, anti-Islamist Ba'athists suddenly die-hard Salafi jihadi ideologues? And of course, the media, even Western mainstream media, plays heavily into ISIS' hands. ISIS take over a town in Anbar and Heath, for example, recently. Headline news, everybody's talking about it. Oh my God, they're approaching Baghdad. In the same time, ISIS lose dozens of cities and towns in Diyal and Salah ad-Din, and the news is buried somewhere in paragraph 8, page 9 of the New York Times. So it's worth remembering ISIS, even till today, couldn't manage to capture the Beji oil refinery. It's the largest oil refinery, extremely hard to defend, and only a few hundred Iraqi special forces till now have stood up against ISIS. And it's in their heartland where they control. ISIS couldn't even capture the town of Armoli, completely surrounded on all sides for over 3 months. Again, defended only by a few hundred Iraqi Shia militias. And ISIS couldn't take it. The capital of Anbar has never fallen, still hasn't fallen to ISIS. And even now they're losing hundreds of soldiers in Kobani, in Syria. So we're seeing a very strange alliance against ISIS in Iraq, clearly demonstrated in Armoli. You have the US Air Force bombing ISIS checkpoints and vehicles. You have IRG, Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors on the ground directing Iranian-backed Shia militias who are assisting the federal forces, who are being supported by the Kurdish Peshmerga. I think it was a couple of months ago, General Petraeus warned that the US Air Force shouldn't be the Air Force of the Shia militias. But at times, recently, it seemed the US Air Force was the Air Force of the Iranian IRGC. They were being fed intelligence from the Iranians, essentially. And of course, the Americans are going to deny this, the Iranians are going to deny this, but they were cooperating with the same units on the ground. In Dhulu'iyya, in Salah ad-Din, north of Baghdad, the alliance was even stranger because we saw the inclusion of Sunni tribes who, believe it or not, were fighting alongside the Shia militias. And one tribal's leader said, and I quote, "We are ready to deal with the devil to fight ISIS." I don't know if by devil he means the central government or the militias. But that is changing. And more Sunni tribes are actually turning against ISIS. So I will conclude by saying ISIS has reached its maximum territorial expansion in Iraq. In Syria, it may have potential to increase, but in Iraq, they've hit a large natural demographic barrier. And if anything, they're going to be squeezed now in these territories. there are many reasons for ISIS popularity in Sunni areas. There is genuine support. There's the element of fear. There's pragmatic reasons. There's ideological reasons. Many see ISIS as restoring Sunni dignity or being a voice of the Sunnis. But in the Shia and Kurdish areas, there is no such ambiguity. There's an over my dead body mentality when it comes to ISIS. So combined with the increasing Sunni tribal pushback against ISIS, I know this may sound controversial, but I think we are witnessing the beginning of the downfall of ISIS, in Iraq at least. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haidar, for an insightful presentation, even though I think some aspects of it are worrying if the army in Iraq is going to now be divided into sectarian militias in each sector, and if the Shia now also have the same feeling as the Kurds that they, do not mind being going into a state of their own. But to maybe shed more light on the Kurdish situation, I want to turn it to Denise, Natalie, and I ask that you all limit your presentations to 10 minutes. We have a large number of people here and in an overflow room, and I'm sure we have lots of questions for the panel. So, Denise, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Carnegie and just note this. Oh, can you hear me? No. Okay, now you can hear me. I'd like to thank Carnegie, Catherine, and note that my comments are my own and not that of the Department of Defense or U.S. government. I'll make this a brief 7 to 10 minutes. I'd like to look at some of the political dynamics in the Kurdistan region and move beyond what we've heard as a statement. ISIS has ruined everything. The Kurds were just about to have a state. We heard this in the summer. There was a lot of brouhaha in the news, and Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan region, was going to declare a state, and everybody was on their edge. And darn it, ISIS blew it. Actually, I'd like to look at it wasn't just because of the Islamic State coming into, or ISIS coming into Mosul on June 10th, that some of the deep political issues, not only between the Kurds and Baghdad, but between the Kurds and Turkey and Baghdad and Turkey and the Kurds across in Syria, were leading to some of these very deep vulnerabilities of the Kurdistan region. And if you look at some of these dynamics, years back that were in the making, we could see, one, that the region, in fact, counterintuitively, is not becoming more autonomous, but in fact less. That some of the, I would say, strategic miscalculations made by Barzani has enhanced the vulnerability of the Kurdistan region so that it is not only more dependent on Baghdad, but now stuck between Baghdad and Turkey. And I would say now that the patron of the Kurdistan region is increasingly becoming Turkey alongside Baghdad. What's happened, there's the June 10th marker, but let's look at some of what I'd like to look at, some of the key dynamics and trends before June 10th that were there anyway, and what has the presence of ISIS done to reinforce or weaken the leverage. And I'm going to look at what is the political leverage of the Kurdistan region and how has it changed. So there were three big issues. And again, we know that there has always been a movement to enhance the internal sovereignty of the Kurdistan region since 2005 because the 2005 Constitution allowed it to. And you had issues of disputed territory. I'll give you the three big ones. There's the disputed territories, the issue of independent oil exports, and, of course, creating an independent state via Turkey. One of these big issues are the disputed territories, and I really do see the ISIS dynamics playing out, not coincidentally, in the northern Iraqi disputed territories, because there has been a push by the Kurdistan region since 2003, from 2003 to 2008 or 10, a movement into some of these areas. These are Sunni Arab areas. These are minority areas. They're in Kirkuk, they're in Nineveh, and of course in some areas of Diyala. That had not changed, and that had still remained an issue of dispute, not only between the Kurds and Baghdad, okay? And as Haidar discussed, as you're starting to see some of the Shia say, you take it, this is not our problem, that this is becoming now a problem between the Kurds and those populations directly. And by that I mean the Sunni Arabs and the minority populations. That remained very sensitive. And so when you started having now oil contracts being signed in disputed territories, even though the governor of Mosul, Athil Nujafi, made a switch and now he's cutting deals with Barzani, there are Sunni Arab tribal groups, people in Nineveh that do not support Nujafi, that are very much against some of what they refer to as Kurdish encroachments in these territories. Okay, so that when June 10th arrived, and I was with some of these folks about 3 weeks later, there was a lot of excitement. New maps were coming out. The Kurds had a 1,000-kilometer border now with ISIS, 45% more territory, so that overnight the Kurdistan region expanded from about 40,000 to 95,000 square kilometers. And part of that included Kirkuk. Okay, so that issue remains, and it didn't go away after June 10th. I'll get to that. The second one was the oil exports. Remember, in May of this year, and this has been a long, ongoing dispute, there's been no hydrocarbons law with Baghdad, but there also has been the Kurds' increasing effort to develop an economy of oil exports independent of Baghdad. Now, in May of this year, 1 month before the ISIS came in and took over Mosul, the Kurds did make this unthinkable break with President Erdogan, and they exported these oil out. What happened in the Iraqi parliament? The Shia, and this was during the so-called government coalition formation period. The Shia group said the Kurds have done something, we can't form a coalition with them. Even Nujafi's party said, you've put us in a very uncomfortable position, we won't be able to form a coalition with you. In some ways, in the beginning, ISIS saved the Kurds in a bit from this predicament because there was no Iraqi group in Baghdad willing to support these independent oil exports. And I say this because I would look at this as beyond Abadi, beyond the new prime minister, that this was going on when this budget dispute occurred. That is, the other oil-producing provinces are starting to say, this is not fair. Why are the Kurds receiving so much money and not giving back to the Iraqi state? That sentiment has not changed. In fact, it's probably become reinforced. Third is the idea of increasing, and this was from one group in the Kurdistan region, and this would largely be the Barzani group, that the Kurds didn't need Baghdad and they truly would become independent through an independent export route with Turkey. And so be it, they may become a vassal state or a client state, but it certainly would be better than being with Baghdad. And I say part of the Kurdistan region because a good part south of Erbil was very much against this, or at least very worried about it. Now, what happened after June 10th is, in fact, has the Kurdistan region gained more leverage? Has this worked to the Kurdistan region, and is it well on its way to becoming more independent? And my answer would be clearly no. Now, what has happened to the Kurds' benefit is, I said, more territory, Kirkuk. They're swearing that they'll never give it back to the Baghdad government. And there's been, obviously, a nationalist surge that the Kurdish Peshmerga are finally back in Kirkuk. And again, there's this cross-border, trans-border nationalist surge about Kobani in Syria. And the international partnerships that the Kurds have established as part of the coalition against ISIS, military weapons, light weapons, and coalition support. This has been, to the Kurds, recognition internationally. But the bad news is when you take 1,000 kilometers of border, you do have to defend it. And my concern would be in the future that, again, I go back to, is if the Iraqi government and security forces aren't going to be there, somebody will be there. And that will be a strong Sunni Arab militia or a strong Sunni Arab province. So the American forces, the coalition forces, they're not going to be there forever, and they're certainly not going to be the Kurdish Air Force forever. So I would see one of these challenges are going to be the Kurds will have to cut a deal not just with Baghdad, but with the Sunni Arabs that control these borders. We can call it ISIS, you can call them the former Ba'athist military officers, but they're certainly Sunni Arab nationalists. And I see this is going to be very complicating for how the Kurds are going to keep these oil fields and keep these territories that are, in my view, some of the heart and soul of Sunni Arab nationalism in Nineveh, and certainly Kirkuk. Secondly, this has reinforced the Kurdistan's vulnerabilities. The gamble, the oil gamble, how to de-risk large-scale exports It hasn't worked. Okay, the fact that 95% of the Kurds' budget came from Baghdad and that this deal was refused in April has meant, no, that they haven't been able to repay $13 billion a year, but instead you've had billions being borrowed from Turkey, you've had further indebtedness internally, and almost a collapse of this economy. So in addition to the ISIS threat that, yes, some oil companies have left, called force majeure or whatever it may be, you also have the issue of payment. That who is going to replace Baghdad, and is Turkey able to do it? So Turkey, in my view, has got the Kurdistan regional government in a pretty much of a control situation. They've got their oil, they can pay them, and they haven't fully paid them. And there is a deep financial crisis right now. This so-called, well, this was the tourism capital of the Arab world, but when you have an ISIS threat and you have an economy that can be paid, much of this tourism industry has collapsed. And again, the precariousness of the energy sector, despite the fact that there still is small scale, about 200,000 barrels going out, the idea of de-risking large-scale exports has not occurred. And finally, you have the vulnerability of the Kurds and Barzani himself as you have the Syrian Kurdish groups emerging. When the Kurds withdrew, or the Barzani group withdrew from Nineveh, this was, let's say, a bit embarrassing for the Kurdish Peshmerga. And so it was actually the PKK who came in and saved some of these Yazidi forces. And this is being played out on the ground. Local populations, I hate to say Barzani's got a bit of face saving to make, but nonetheless, it was the fact that it was the PKK that saved the Yazidis, B, that Turkey did not come to the defense militarily of the KRG, and the Kurds expressed their disappointment. 3, the fact that the economy is in a state because of this oil gamble. And 4th, there's this whole Kobani crisis and struggle to save Kobani. So you're having now this movement to authenticate these nationalist credentials coming from each of these different Kurdish groups. And that gets to my final point, which is the internal power struggles. Even though that this anti-ISIS movement certainly has created a Kurdish coalition or partnership on the ground. PYD people are finally able to enter the Kurdistan region, and they're having meetings and yada yada. Still, some of these underlying power struggles are going on, not only between the PKK or PYD and Barzani, but internally inside the Kurdistan region. You have a new president of Iraq, who is from the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and you have a governor of Kirkuk, and Kirkuk is largely a PUK area. This does not bode well for an idea that the Kurds are just going to, in one unified entity, jump on board with Turkey. Again, the fact that Turkey, and I'm still surprised that some Kurdish groups thought that Turkey was going to enter and defend the Kurds militarily, but this has really cut into the streets of the Kurdistan region that do they really want to become an independent state that has to be fully reliant on Turkey? So this is creating some changes on the ground as well, and certainly south of Erbil, and by that I mean PUK, that, Baghdad is the realistic option. And of course, as Haider discussed, there have been important Iranian enforcements in the Kurdistan region. The PUK, not the KDP Peshmerga, have been fighting in these areas that are not privy to coalition airstrikes, Diyala, south of Kirkuk, alongside some of the Shia militias as well. So you have a lot of these dynamics. The idea, again, when you ask, will the Kurds become independent? Is this a nation-building moment? The question is, how autonomous can the Kurdistan region become, and what kind of state do they want to become, and how dependent will they be on Turkey or Baghdad? Those are the kind of questions I would look at. So contrary to popular discourse, I don't see an independent state, at least inclusive of Kirkuk and Nineveh, anytime in the near future. But this issue of how to negotiate stability, it's going to be beyond Baghdad. This is now going to be a Kurd, Sunni Arab issue. So the dialectic will be there between the central government or the Iraqi government and Kurds when it comes to revenues and payments, but sharing and delineating borders, particularly if the Sunni Arab groups decide to create their own region, is not or may not necessarily be in the Kurds' favor. Finally, oil is high risk. And I don't see where the Kurds right now have enhanced their leverage when Baghdad is certainly not going to pay these oil company contracts. So the question still remains unanswered, is how these large-scale exports will be de-risked and to be able to sustain the region. So there's either going to have to be a deal cut with Turkey or a deal cut with the Sunni Arabs or a deal cut with Baghdad. And this may have to force the Kurds' hand and may actually have to realize less than what they imagined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. And perhaps later on in the question and answer session, you can elaborate on the evolving relationship with Turkey and Turkey's position.
I only have 10 minutes, so
of course.
Watching the clock.
Joe will talk about Syria and Lebanon. Right?
Thank you, Marwan, and thank you for Carnegie, and thank you for not only for having me in this session, in this panel, but to welcome me in Carnegie, and thanks for Catherine also. I'm looking forward for several years of intense cooperation with you. In fact, now let's turn a bit westward and talk about, or try to talk about, Syria and Lebanon and the border between Syria and Lebanon, and to try to understand what's exactly happening there and who is doing what. And this will be probably my first point, in fact, trying to shed a light on this nebulous component of radical jihadists that are acting on the border. What I would try to say in this first point is the fact that, in fact, the name ISIS or the brand ISIS has become probably a generic brand under which a whole bunch, a very complex bunch of other organizations or actors are put under, meaning that we have shades going from ISIS to Jabhat al-Nusra to other groups mainly operating in Lebanon, on the border and inside the territory. And all this is because probably lack of intelligence or also lack of information and etc. labeled under the name of ISIS. Now this is amplified, for instance, in Lebanon by the fact that the most violent incidents that occurred a year or two from now were not exactly or completely or officially claimed by something called ISIS. For instance, the bombings in the hotels in Beirut or in the southern suburb were claimed by a group called the Brigades of Abdullah al-Azzam, who is in fact directly linked to al-Qaeda, a bit like, for instance, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is not the case of ISIS. The 44 Lebanese soldiers that are today abducted after the Battle of Arsal in the Bekaa are also held, supposedly, and we still don't have exact info about that, by probably 10 of them by ISIS and others by groups, among them Jabhat al-Nusra and others, which are still officially unknown or who don't have let's say an official branding or naming. So that is to say that in fact the dynamics between what we consider to be ISIS in the Lebanese Syrian region or on the border and other groups is something which is fluctuant and dynamic. This sheds a light, I think, on, and here I'll talk a little bit on the Syrian landscape, probably Yazid will say more on that, but it sheds a light also on the contradictions and maybe the unintended consequences of the US coalition-led effort to fight ISIS. Prior to the strikes of the coalition, all info leads us to say that ISIS was probably losing the battle of hearts and mind in Syria. It was losing it to probably groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or to groups like Ahrar al-Sham and others. Now, the question of whether these strikes have given, again, some credit to ISIS in the Syrian population is something I can't answer, and I don't know, and I don't think we know about it. However, what we know and what we have indicators about is that Jabhat al-Nusra has so far probably benefited from these strikes. It has benefited also by the labeling by the US and other actors under the terror list, but also it has benefited from the fact that, in fact, historically, Jabhat al-Nusra, to the difference with ISIS in Syria at least, has been credited to be a very active component into the anti-Assad, let's say, military campaign or operations, which is not the fact of ISIS. This, in fact, sheds a light or amplifies the second point, which I would like to talk about, which is more on Lebanon, which is, in fact, this famous Sunni disenfranchising feeling and sentiment. In fact, when you look at the Lebanese political or security landscape or security scene, what we can say is the following. The first point or the first striking element is that the hotspots that we are having today in Lebanon are partly on the border between Lebanon and Syria, but partly have, in fact, less to do with what's happening on the border. The first hotspot that began, in fact, in 2012 or 2013 was the city of Saida, with the famous Battle of Abra that put, in fact, in confrontation the Lebanese army and a Salafi group led by Muhammad al-Asir at that moment. And Asir is probably someone who is more linked also to the Qaeda milieu or to the Jabhat al-Nusra milieu than to ISIS. The second hotspot, which is today very flaring up, is the Tripoli and northern Lebanon, i.e. Tripoli, Akkar, and the region above Tripoli. This is very interesting because it tells us something, in fact, which is much more related, in fact, to the Iraqi case than to the Syrian case, which means that, in fact, all these hotspots or these points of friction between radical Sunnism and other forces are, in fact, largely predating and tracing back to before the Syrian revolution. Tripoli, for instance, is a city where you have sporadic or sometimes more than sporadic fights between radical Sunni groups and other forces like the Syrian army at one point and then the Lebanese army after that since a period of 1983, 1984, 1985. If you remember, it traces back to the fact that, for instance, the PLO and Yasser Arafat at that moment took refuge in the city, and then there were fights between various shades of radical Islamist groups and Alawi fighters at that moment, and then the Syrian army, and then consequently the Lebanese army after the ousting or the exit of the Syrian army from Lebanon. Now, the latest of these hotspots has to do directly with what's happening on the Syrian-Lebanese border, and this is the shape, this is the arch going from probably Arsal or the northern Bekaa, Brital, and etc., until or reaching down southward to Rashaya and the Shab'a region. Now, probably this third hotspot, which is the potential danger as far as security is concerned in Lebanon, is itself directly related to what is happening in Syria. First of all, I think the factor that is probably to be closely watched is the presence of probably more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees in that region of Lebanon. Now, of course, the sociology of refugees, of Syrian refugees in Lebanon is very hard to depict and to understand, but let us say that to the difference of Turkey and Jordan, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are scattered all over the countries. We don't have specific camps, so it is difficult to, let us say, to judge exactly the level, the intensity, the nature of that human presence. But what we can say also is that in the majority of cases, and this is what leads to the second point, these refugees are in regions where there is a strong promiscuity with the Shia Lebanese population and with population which is politically, militarily, and etc. controlled or influenced or proximal to Hezbollah. So this is the first factor of friction. Now, the second factor of friction in this area stretching on the border is, in fact, what we now all call and know as being the borders fading away. And regardless of the polemics and the narratives of who started what and etc., what we can say today with great assurance is that the fading of the borders between Lebanon and Syria has been largely enhanced, if not caused, by, in fact, the cross-border operation that was started by Hezbollah very soon in the Syrian revolution and then the Syrian war. This has slided, in fact, incrementally and very interestingly in terms of argument. If you remember, the first argument or the first legitimization of Hezbollah entering the Syrian war was the fact that, and it was the first speeches by Hassan Nasrallah, it was that we are there to defend the Shia villages that are on the border, and some of them are from the other side of the fence between Syria and Lebanon. And then the argument slided a little bit, it slipped. It became we are defending the holy shrines, Sayyida Zainab, etc., in Syria. And then on a third level, later on in 2012, the argument became we are defending a resistance regime. We are defending the Mumana'a axis openly. And then, lastly, it became an openly Shia discourse, very strongly toned or tainted by Shia, let's say, lexicon. We are the sons of Hussein and etc., and we are waging or we are leading an existential war against takfirism and etc., etc. The last speech of Hassan Nasrallah 2 or 3 days ago, even going very far in openly and namely, let's say, targeting Wahhabi Sunnism as being the most important danger today for the region. So this phenomenon, in fact, is something that has to do, of course, with the Syrian, let's say, focus of violence or the Syrian volcano or conundrum, but it also has to do with some deep issues that are left unsolved in the Lebanese scene. And what I would conclude by saying here is the fact that, in fact, what is happening on the Lebanese-Syrian border and mostly inside the Lebanese territory or inside the Lebanese political space is something which is more resembling to Iraq than to Syria, in the sense that these are old feuds or old, let's say, accounts unsettled that are today fueled again by the Syrian war and the Syrian revolution. Meaning that, in fact, the feeling of Sunni disenfranchising in Lebanon is something that traces back probably, if not to 2003 and the fall of Baghdad, but very openly and very visibly to 2005, the killing of Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. Then in 2008, the Hezbollah takeover of Beirut and the kind of hidden coup d'etat that happened at that moment. And 2010 and 2011 and the Syrian revolution and the Syrian war only added an additional, let's say, factor of inflammation on this Lebanese scene. So this leads us to say that there is a security, of course, treatment to the issue of ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other Islamist radical shades in Lebanon, but this cannot by itself be a sufficient or a relevant answer if you put aside the political question of the renewing or the reshaping or the reviving of the political formula in Lebanon. Now, if we extend that question to the Lebanese and Syrian political scene, it means that, in fact, the security solution, and I don't think I'm telling you something new here, the military solution to ISIS and other shades of radical jihadism is not only a military solution, but it has also to embody or to include a political component, and this leads to the lingering question, which is in fact roaming around in the region and here in Washington. And the question is what to do with Assad and what to do after Assad in Lebanon and in Syria. I'll stop there and probably we'll go into details.
Thank you very much, Joe. So one thing I would like you maybe to comment on later in the question and answer session is whether you think this Sunni marginalization, Hezbollah's role, and the sectarian tension in Lebanon, whether you think that can amount to more than just detention, whether we are going to see a repeat, for example, of a civil war, or is that not on the cards in Lebanon? But I'll leave that question till the question and answer session. Yazid, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks for leaving me to last. I'm going to present a series of statements and questions that I'm not going to attempt to answer or to flesh out in detail, and I'll leave that for later on. But here's where I see things and where I see a need to focus attention. First, Syria. It's really quite striking if you think back a year ago or just over a year ago, how much has changed in the geopolitics, on the military level, on the ground outside Syria, but how little has changed in the conflict dynamic and in the politics or the prospect for a political shift in Syria. Just over a year ago, we had the chemical weapons attack in Damascus and a rare moment of US-Russian cooperation that led to most of the disarmament or elimination of at least most of the Syrian chemical weapons capability, Russian-American cooperation leading to the Geneva II talks that ultimately failed, the Ukraine crisis, which has completely changed that dynamic, the rise of ISIS since the start of the year, and especially since June, of course, in Iraq, any number of other shifts that have occurred in the general strategic environment, on the ground militarily. If you look at the map of where the so-called moderate and not so moderate opposition of Jabhat al-Nusra were a year or just over a year ago around Syria, and you look at their map today, they now basically are focused in two main pockets in the far northwest and in the far south, with a little bit around Damascus. To flesh that out slightly, at the start of 2013, it was estimated that there were 10 million people in liberated areas of Syria. Today, the opposition will acknowledge that there are under 2 million people in those areas. These are all big changes, and I could go on with the detail, but the point I'm trying to make is that neither the opposition nor the regime appears any closer to operating differently in terms of its politics or shifting where this conflict is going. We seem stuck in that position. The next point I want to make is that Iraq, it seems to me, faces a very real risk of ending up pretty much in the same kind of situation that Syria is now in. In other words, attempts made by the US and the Europeans, by Saudi Arabia and Iran, by Turkey, by various players to try and push and cajole and nudge various political actors inside Iraq into a new kind of politics, or at least a minimum level of agreement that would transform the Baghdad government, the way the Iraqi state is run, and then allow a certain number of other changes, military and in terms of delivery of government services and so on. However, all of that is pretty messy. Most of the actors are still trying to preserve their core positions and their core interests without changing too much. The sort of international coalition that's led by the US today, I feel, is frankly minimal and way below what is needed. Whether this is a fault of the US administration or it's just a realistic recognition of the difficulties of working in Iraq is for you to think about. But bottom line, I'm saying that I think the likelihood that Iraq will end up in a situation where no one can really decide the issue, where the sectarian dynamic, where building new sectarian militias rather than a new single army, is likely to do as much damage as good, all that really points to yet another Syrian scenario, and we have to think about those implications. Third, I think the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, will be around for some time, in Iraq and in Syria. Let me give you a glimpse from Syria of what I mean. I don't think ISIS is liked by people living in its under its rule, and I don't think that's quite the issue. Saddam Hussein, to take, I think, a very useful historical analogy with another Iraqi dictatorial regime, Saddam Hussein managed to cling to power for 13 years after invading Kuwait and after Iraq was subjected to very severe sanctions, 12 years after the humiliating defeat in Kuwait and the loss, of course, of most of the oil revenue. And nonetheless, despite being a reviled regime, it managed to survive. So that's not the issue with the Islamic State. The Islamic State certainly in Syria, from reports that come from the ground, the Islamic State is constantly developing and evolving its forms of rule, of internal organization, of bureaucratic service delivery, building up a tax system, a database of what people do for a living, all sorts of things that are going on every day, which mean that whether people like it or not, they regard areas of IS rule as being more secure and more dependable and predictable than areas held either by the so-called moderate opposition or the Assad regime. And that doing business is actually cheaper in those areas in terms of the taxes they have to pay versus the bribes and taxes and other fees that are extorted from them elsewhere. So I think we really need to start looking carefully at what IS is, regardless of how we feel about it. Fourth, even if al-khoei is correct, I was very interested in his presentation, and this is the beginning of the end for IS, at least in Iraq. Let's not forget that going back to where Iraq was is no great thing. The Iraqi state had failed, basically, had failed its people since the removal of Saddam Hussein. In the first 10 years after that, the Iraqi government spent $500 billion of public revenue and did not build a single hospital, a single power plant. That is failure on, frankly, an astonishing scale. And so defeating ISIS, if that means going back to what the Iraqi state was, and I really see very little prospect of going back to anything different all of a sudden, then I think we have to keep very much focused and very worried about what happens next in Iraq. Now, I've described in a way where I think we are now. I'd like to add a few more comments in the form of questions, if you like, as to what next. Well, first, who of us still remembers that there's an air campaign going on in Syria and Iraq? I mean, I'll confess, frankly, I get up in the morning, I look at the news. That bit of news I never look at. I'm not even aware. Maybe the strike stopped a week ago. Maybe someone will tell me. Because I don't think they're important or relevant, certainly in Syria. What I'm saying, basically, what if this air campaign goes on for another month, 2 months, 6 months, and then what? Is this like Iraq under the sanctions in the second half of the 1990s, when there were daily bombings going on, to the point that none of us even remembered that this was going on? I don't see this campaign, in Syria at least, and probably not in Syria and Iraq, just going on indefinitely without more of a game plan. And I don't see a game plan. The follow-on question to that is, what if IS is not defeated quite soon? The Pentagon very sensibly, I think, anticipates or is planning for a campaign of up to 3 years. I think that's the good case scenario. That's the best case scenario. And even that is a long time. If this campaign continues, what starts to happen elsewhere? In Iraq or in Syria, maybe in parts of Turkey, in Lebanon and Jordan? What about the sort of the knock-on effect or the mimic effect in places like parts of Egypt and Sinai, in Yemen, in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, I don't know where? We have become so focused on Iraq and to a lesser extent Syria or Kobani at least, rightfully, but that I think we're assuming that these other areas can be held in limbo pretty much, and that the threat can be held at bay. It's holding for a moment in Lebanon because the Hariri camp and Hezbollah and others have come to understand that they need each other, and they have to be wary about undermining each other any further, because they're all going to lose in that game. In Jordan is a strong state, there are competent institutions. But there too, there's a massive underclass that sees the Islamic State as representing everything they resent. I mean, rather, they're representing a radical response or challenge to everything they resent about those with money, the affluent, the ones driving BMWs and Mercedes cars around West Amman. These kinds of dynamics are ongoing. And so if the fight against the Islamic State goes on and is seen to be conducted either in ways that are problematic or to fail, then I think we should worry about what happens in the wider region. And that is my final question, which is, what if Iraq moves from a state of de facto partition, rather like that in Syria for the last 2 or so years? What if the Iraqi state visibly disintegrates? If, by building up sort of emergency military forces to counter the Islamic State that are actually entirely sectarian militias, a Sunni National Guard and other Shia militias that stand in for the Iraqi army. And if that happens with the police, with the intelligence service, with public service delivery ministries and so on, what if we move from de facto partition to something that looks more like a broken up state, or at least a partition state, not simply a partition territory? What will the implications be for other parts of the region? Or will we simply see, as I've suggested, another Syria that most of us struggle to contain and keep within those limits, but don't really resolve in any more fundamental manner?
Thank you so much, Yazid, for a series of very provocative questions that we, I think, also need to think of beyond the military capability of and reach of ISIS. In the interest of time, I want to open it up immediately to questions. We have half an hour only. I will take questions in batches of 3. Please limit it to 1 question and make it short if you don't mind, please. Can you wait for the microphone, please, and identify yourself?
Soli Özel from Kadir Has University. You did not mention either Iran or Israel. Israel bought that oil from the Kurds and actually deposited the money as the Turks demanded in Halkbank. Then Gaza intervened and Mosul fell. And it seems to me that something could have happened there strategically that fell apart. And as for Iran, don't you think that after Mosul and the lack of intervention on the part of the Turks, at least visibly, the Iranians did not gain ground among the KRG, among the Barzani people in KRG, and then helped the non-Barzani people in KRG?
Thank you. Please. Yes. Yes. The woman, please. No, Nadia, please. No.
I'm a national defense expert from Argentina, also NDU, National Defense University here. My question is very simple. I would like to know, besides the religious difference between Sunnis and Shiites, which is the difference between the education of those groups and why, if there is a big gap?
Okay. In the back, over there.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. Just wanted to point out from what we heard from Mr. Yazidi and Mr. Haider and others too, it seems like the U.S. invasion of Iraq was the main problem and is what has created all this turbulence in Iraq and all this. And in fact, my thesis is that the Syrian situation that has gone on was also planned by CIA and U.S. military in terms of sneaking in all these groups into Syria. Because George Bush has once said to Assad, if you don't cooperate with us, you'll be in trouble. And I think all this is this great chaos that has been caused by the United States. And what should be done with it? Should the United States get out of it?
Let's take one more question. Okay, then let's start. Don't all feel you have to answer every question. Please pick and choose the ones that you think you need to.
I'll respond to your question. I tried so hard to make the 7 to 10 minute, I couldn't even get on Israel. Yes, Israel. Remember, Iraq's threats against any company or country that buys Kurdish oil doesn't really affect Israel because they're officially at war with Iraq, correct? So they have bought this oil. I think 7 cargoes or whatnot, and that continues at significantly discounted rates. Significant. So, the way that it works is ships go out to sea, radars get turned off, ship-to-ship transfer, and this is the way that this has been a very murky business, and it will continue. But you're right, and it's gone through Turkey. So some Israelis can say, we've got to thank Erdogan for allowing this all to happen. The problem is this, too, in terms of this Halkbank business. This was Erdogan's red line, by the way. that I actually think that the Kurds, at least some of them, were willing to cut that deal with Baghdad because they know they have to. But it was Erdogan who said the red line was the money's got to go in my account, not the DFI account in New York. He wouldn't have it, obviously. So even if this money's going in, what's being stated is 17% is going to the Kurdistan region, no more. And then you've got to take out your deductions. And again, that's not clear. How much? So this will continue, and the Israelis will continue. Back to Iran, remember, after the Islamic State came in, there was about 6 weeks where Barzani said, we're not getting involved. We're not fighting them. And then there was a press conference, and he made a clear statement, not the PUK. We want to thank the Iranians. They were the first ones to come into the Kurdistan region and help us. So I don't know if they've necessarily gained or lost ground because they will always remain a very important influence in the region. There's over 200 kilometers of border there that they share with the Suleimania area. So that in and of itself, that was a statement in my view that said, we recognize you, we're not moving too far. But they have been very active and they have gained some support, and more so as Qasem Soleimani. You've seen all of these photos, right? With his arms around the Kurdish Peshmerga in Amerli, in Diyala, particularly since the coalition airstrikes, in the perception of Kurds and others, have largely been targeted on Barzani areas. Most of the military aid is being perceived, or it's true, being going to the Erbil and not the PUK. This is moving them to say, that, thank goodness we have the Iranians. And in Kirkuk, they are fighting next to the Badr forces, the Iranian forces, and PUK forces. Okay, so it's, again, I don't know if this has significantly changed events, but it certainly has reinforced the dependency in the turning to Iran by some of these groups.
Please, Haider.
I'll leave the Sunni Shia question for Yazid and Joseph to tackle. But the gentleman who asked about the US invasion causing all these problems, I think it's a very simplistic way of looking at the situation. I mean, you had the Ba'ath regime during the 80s, the 8-year war with Iran. 1 million human beings were killed. You had the 1990 wholesale rape and pillaging of Kuwait. You had the 1991 uprising where up to 200,000 military-aged men were slaughtered. So a lot of people unfortunately think sectarianism started in 2003 because that's when it first rose to the surface in terms of politics. But sectarianism is as old as Islam. I think it's very unfair to pretend this all started in 2003 or, as some argue, in 1979. I mean, in the first century of Islam, you had civil wars over the very soul of Islam and what Islam means. You had 10th century violence in Baghdad. You had 15th, 16th century mass slaughters of Shias and Sunnis in Iran, in Iraq, in Turkey. This is nothing new. So yes, action in 2003 had consequences, and we're seeing this today. But inaction also has consequences, and we can't see that. If there was no regime change in 2003, Saddam Hussein would likely still be in power today. If not, one of his sadistic sons would have been in power. That brutal regime which systematically slaughtered Iraqis in its 3 decades of rule would still be in power today. So it's not as simple as, this all started in 2003.
Joe?
In fact, I would also leave the Sunni Shia question to Yazid, but, although you partly answered it now. But in fact, I would turn to Marwan's question, which is probably I didn't have time to tackle, which is the most important regarding Lebanon. The question is how far and how long can we keep contained the potential violence in the country from transforming from, let's say, sporadic pockets of instability and friction to all-out civil war, quote-unquote, because civil war is something to be defined. Briefly, let me say that so far two factors, in fact, has contributed to very much contain the violence in Lebanon and keep the country more or less manageable if we agree that today we have an entire space, which is Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, which is in fact sunk into a kind of dynamics of violence. What has helped Lebanon to be relatively contained is two factors. The first one, I think, is a regional minimum consensus, not to throw the Lebanese card into the volcano, into the Syrian volcano. This minimal regional consensus is mainly a Saudi-Iranian, let's say, agreement not to, in fact, fight on the Lebanese soil as they are fighting on the Iraqi, Syrian, and probably Yemeni soil. Plus a kind of relative domestic appetite Yazid alluded to, that in fact the Hariris and the 14th of March camp and the 8th of March camp, the Hezbollah camp, are in fact more or less needing each other to keep things going on. The second factor that kept it also contained is, so far, the fact that Hezbollah is, by all means, militarily, politically, sociologically, etc., the relative and maybe absolute strongest force on the landscape, on the scene. And so it is in the mind of all other forces useless to try to resist it, fight it, etc., etc. Now, my view, and this is maybe pessimistic, is that these two factors along the way, along the road, are probably risking erosion. I mean, we could see erosion of these two factors. The first one has to do, of course, with the regional construction. If we don't reach a proper, satisfactory deal or understanding with Iran in the months to come, probably the Cold War between Iran and the Saudis, Iran and the Gulf states, Iran and others, and Turkey maybe, will get hotter and hotter. At that point, one or both actors could think that now we maybe need an additional card or an additional theater in order to mend fences or to settle our accounts. Let's put Lebanon in the equation. Yemen is, for instance, very interesting to see. Now, there's a new front that has been opened in Yemen. Maybe potentially Lebanon could be also a new front. The second factor, I think, is more worrying. It is changing due to the refugee sociology. You know, in the Sunni mindset, the Syrian refugees are partly Syrians, but they are also Sunni refugees. And in a way, these poor people living in very poor conditions, in regions and areas in promiscuity with Hezbollah, could easily be weaponized, armed, and mobilized against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And even without a kind of impetus by a Sunni leadership in Lebanon or in the region, by nature themselves, they could become weaponized with time if the kind of, let us say, persecution, quote unquote, they are anyway perceiving as such, is continuing against them. And I mean, if you take the numbers, 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, you can easily imagine that you can mobilize, arm, and finance 20 to 30,000 young guys stretching from 16 years old to 25 years old. And like in 1975, build a kind of reserve army for the Sunni political force which feels more and more humiliated in Lebanon. This is, I think, the factor that has to be closely watched, and it has to be watched from the Lebanese leadership point of view, and mainly from the Sunni leadership in Lebanon, which is, and this is an additional factor to be feared of, which is in fact eroding let's say, the moderate Sunni traditional leadership in Lebanon, embodied by the Hariri camp, by other personalities, the wood or the contenders of the Hariris like Mikati, Safadi, and etc., are today, if not absentee, at least more and more fragilized, weakened by this wind of radicalization in the region, or by the mere fact that, in fact, in terms of balance of power, there are not enough existing on the ground. So for all these factors, I think that what has contained the Lebanese scene so far is something that is unfortunately to be questioned more and more in the months and years to come. which has to do with what Yazid was saying, that in fact, if we take a look to the entire region, broader than Iraq and Syria and the pockets of ISIS and Kobani and etc., the dynamics in the region are in fact very worrying for the period ahead.
Indeed. Yazid?
I guess there are people in the audience that appreciate the irony of asking someone called Yazid to comment on the Sunni-Shia divide.
And he's not a Yazidi also.
Not a Yazidi. My people suffer. But, I'm not sure I heard or understood the question about Sunni Shia. It seemed to be about education, and that made me think, well, it's an extremely broad question. It's like saying, what's the difference between Catholic and Protestant education in Europe? I mean, it's something on that level of generality. And I think what's more useful maybe is if I try to step back from this new way we have of seeing all politics in the region through the prism of sectarianism. 2003, the US went into Iraq and discovered tribes, and then for a while everything became about tribes and tribalism, although as far as I can tell, right up till the present, there's very little understanding of tribal society and its dynamics in Iraq specifically, or in Syria for that matter. And now the new thing is Sunnis and Shia. And I think there are counterexamples across the region that show that, of course, there's sectarianism, just as there are other forms of ideological motivation, Islamism or Jewish nationalism in the West Bank and so on. These do reflect realities. At the same time, is that in fact the primary driving force? If you look at Yemen, where now we're told that the Houthis are Shia rebels specifically. We don't even call them Zaydis anymore. They're called Shia rebels because they can then be fit into this wider framework of analysis. Well, how come that from the late 1970s, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is a Zaydi, i.e. Shia, ruled Yemen, no one ever spoke about sectarianism or spoke of Shia minority rule in Yemen? Because for most Yemenis, that just wasn't the issue and wasn't the frame through which they understood that relationship. It was about authoritarianism and tribal alliances and so on. And fundamentally, that's still the case in Yemen. Then if you look at somewhere like Tunisia, which has produced thousands of jihadist volunteers for Syria and Iraq, Tunisia is almost entirely a Sunni country, with the exclusion of a few Jews, maybe the odd Christian, but no Shia. And there, when they use the anti-Shia discourse, it has nothing to do with their direct reality. Rather, it has a lot more to do with the fact that most jihadist volunteers from Tunisia come from peripheral towns, the underdeveloped regions of the south, Sidi Bouzid, Tatawin, and places like that, who have given up on their hopes of the revolution giving sort of a new scope on life, new socioeconomic realities, and seek something that fundamentally changes everything. And they go to Syria and Iraq to wage jihad, they now cloak it in terms of anti-Shiism. What that really is that what really drives them? I'd question that. So I think there's a much more nuanced mix of things where there is a Sunni-Shia divide, certainly that's more real in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, definitely. Whether the Sunnis and Shias who are involved in this are primarily motivated by their sectarian perspective of the other or not, I would question. I think that there is a lot more to it than that, and I think I'll stop there.
Great. Let's open it up for another round. Amal.
Can I have a clarification for what he said, and then I can ask my question very quick? About Yemen.
Make it short.
About Yemen, because he said there was nothing about Shiism in Yemen, although there are Zaydis. There was no Iran at that time. And things happened when Houthi went to Tehran and to Iran and lived there and came back, and they started spreading Iranian influence in Yemen. So my question is, it's a serious question. Where is the Khalifa? Since the start of the campaign, we have not heard from him, which is very un-Arab. I mean, Arab leaders usually during battle, they give speeches and Saddam's. And so this, we haven't heard from him. What does this say about the leadership of ISIS. And Mr. Khoei, you talked about the other groups with them. I mean, there were like 8 groups with ISIS when it started in Iraq, and then we don't hear about them. Do you think what you talked about, like some kind of defections from the group, do you think this is going to happen? Do you think people can pull the rug from under their feet by taking the other groups like Duri and other people who are supporting him militarily? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, in the back over there.
Hi, I'm Lara Jakes with Associated Press. I wanted to ask you all about where should we be thinking about Bashar Assad going on from here. The Obama administration has made it pretty clear that dealing with ISIS is the #1 priority right now, not dealing with Assad. What I heard today is that the Pentagon's plan or 3-year campaign for fighting ISIS is pretty optimistic. So are we looking at not dealing with Assad for 3+ years going on, or how do you see any kind of resolution to what is clearly something that's going to destabilize the region for some time, as it has already? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir. Please.
Kumar, and I'm not in politics, but it's a pretty depressing picture that's being presented here. Are there any stabilizing forces at all for the region? And what would a stable Middle East look like?
Let me add also a question to Denise. If you can elaborate on the PKK's new role fighting ISIS and the relationship between the Syrian and the Iraqi Kurds now, particularly the Kurds that are holding off ISIS in Kobani. And I think we have 5 minutes to answer all these questions. So maybe we can start with Joe this time.
In fact, the question of Assad, I concluded on that. I think that at least in Iraq and Lebanon, when you see the nature and the depth of the Syrian feeling of humiliation, disenfranchising, and etc., regardless of how real and how constructed and over-perceived it is, it's another debate. It leads us, or it tells us that, in fact, without a political component to what is happening, political component meaning a political reconstruction of these countries, a new social pact, a new political pact, which has to do with authoritarian regimes. I mean, the way Haidar described the Saddam regime in the past, which is very resemblant to the Assad regime, in fact. Regardless of that, I think all other military answers, drones, sending, intelligence gathering, strikes, and etc., are nice, but they won't lead anywhere, provided they won't also amplify violence and the recruitment of jihadists or radicals in the future. So that's the first level of answer. Now, on Syria, also, regardless of their narratives and what is our assessment, is Assad partly responsible of the creation and rise of ISIS, which I partly believe, but it's not only the case. I mean, ISIS existed before and will exist probably. ISIS or another form of radical jihadism will exist after Assad. This is beyond the question. I mean, it's sure that it will be the case, but also it raises the question of the feasibility. Let's put aside ethics or a normative approach to that question. I mean, should Assad leave or not? Everybody has his opinion. But in terms of feasibility, technical feasibility of the issue, I think that so far what we see, i.e., the Western coalition putting aside the Assad factor in the struggle or the crusade against ISIS, if I want to use, let's say, pejorative terms, is in fact backlashing so far. For instance, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, something new occurred, probably Yazid is much aware of it, in the northwest of Syria, in Idlib area, whereby Jabhat al-Nusra attacked one of the labeled moderate rebellious factions in Syria, the Syrian Revolutionary Front of Jamal Maruf. And it attacked it very directly under the argument that, in fact, these people are today only fighting ISIS and forgetting about the core of the revolution, which is fighting Assad. So if at one point there are no two legs in this fighting against what's happening or trying to curb what's happening in the region. Two legs, i.e. fighting and curbing ISIS and the relatives of ISIS, and also seeking a political solution to the regimes in that region, to the political construction in that region. I think that this one-leg approach will soon falter and probably fall down and produce unintended consequences. So even if we put ethics aside or political normativism aside, by mere fact of feasibility, I think we have to include a political component, and in Syria it has to do with something called the Assad question and the political solution for Syria, if we know what is a political solution for Syria.
Thank you. Haidar?
Where is the caliph? It's a $1 million question or $50 million question. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be sitting here today. It appears he's keeping a low profile after the first initial very flamboyant public appearance in the central mosque in Mosul. But in terms of the factions, I was in Erbil a few weeks after the fall of Mosul, and I spoke to an Iraqi Christian whose family fled from Mosul as ISIS advanced. And he said, according to him, it's true that there were only about 800 to 1,000 ISIS fighters who made the initial push into Mosul. But he said the next morning there were 10,000. Now, what does this mean? It's mere membership of ISIS is very fluid. People see ISIS as the winning side. They've managed to defeat a 20, 30,000 strong Iraqi army. But this is why I think ISIS can't maintain their supremacy in these areas, because they've kicked out very successfully kicked out the mutual enemy, and now their attention is focused on each other. Who that will be, I don't know. The Naqshbandis, Jaish al-Mujahideen, the Islamic Army of Iraq, other non-Islamist tribal forces. It's not clear who's going to come out on top, but ISIS is losing ground today. Sunni tribes are turning. Some Sunni tribes are turning. And Sunni tribes are usually a good indicator of which way the winds are blowing. And that's why I see their power is going to diminish. And also they have massive economic problems to deal with, especially in Mosul. I can't remember who first said this in June. ISIS went from being one of the richest terrorist groups in the world to one of the poorest states in the world. And that's why I say they're not going to maintain their grip. How, who, when, I honestly can't say.
I'll take on the question. I'm trying to make this brief. The PKK fighting ISIS and the Kurds in Syria and Iraq. One thing this whole bit has done, it has elevated the PKK, and I say PYD as well. They have become, at least in the eyes of most Kurds, legitimized. They are heroes in the vast majority of all of the Kurdish regions, and that coincides with the fact, as I indicated, when Barzani's forces withdrew from Sinjar, it was the PKK that saved them. And there have been demonstrations and mobilizations across, tens and thousands about this saving Kobani. So PKK is emergent as a hero. There are Kurds in Iraq that are leaving to join this group, and you will see that they have these young fighters who don't have a quarter of the weapons of the Kurds in Iraq, and they're still able to maintain. So this has really reinforced their image. And the fact that weapons have been distributed to the PYD and there has been a differentiation has semi-legitimized the PYD internationally as well. That's a PYD. Relationship between these two groups. Look, there's two main trends in the Kurdistan region. There's the Barzani group who dreams to be king of all the Kurds, and there's the PYD/PKK group. Both of them, they're not having an outright civil war, particularly since the PKK is lodged in the Kandil Mountains in the north of Iraq. However, this joint ISIS partnership certainly has brought the two groups together who have been feuding over the last couple of years. Look, the Barzanis had built a trench and forbid the PYD leaders from even entering the Kurdistan region. So the fact that the trenches, the blockade is gone, and now the PYD leader can actually step foot in Erbil is a big thing, I guess. However, I don't think the very fact that Barzani still represents the envoy of Erdogan. And as long as Barzani represents the envoy of Erdogan, and as long as the Kurdish problem in Turkey is not only not resolved but getting worsened, I think there will be a limitation. And I think these power struggles are still going on, by the way. They're discrete. Between where the PYD and how far the Barzani's groups can go. For example, now that Turkey or Erdogan has permitted some Kurdish Peshmerga to enter Syria, no coincidence, it was only the KDP Peshmerga he allowed to be entering into. So there's going to be some power struggles and some game playing. And again, Barzani is still very tied and very controlled in some ways by Turkey, and that's going to be a red line for the Kurds in Syria. I just want to make one point about the AP question about our strategy to overthrowing Assad. And again, I speak on my own behalf, but there seems to be two different even trends within the coalition. As of this point, the United States' strategy is not regime change in Syria. There are coalition partners, and I will say Turkey is one, that prioritizes regime change in Syria. For the United States, it seems that Iraq is a easier beast to tackle, and I say that relatively because there's already a government in place, there are forces on the ground, there are people working in partnerships. Syria does not have that. So one of the issues between, I'd say, some U.S. or coalition partners in Turkey is Turkey wants the no-fly zone, the buffer zone, and overthrowing the Assad regime. So I don't see that in the larger game plan unless we want to have another, more than 3-year plus commitment to fixing Syria.
Okay, Yazid, you have the last short word.
Thanks. I just wanted to say that I think the U.S. does not have the option and should not exercise the option of dealing with the Assad regime politically outside of some type of power sharing agreement involving the opposition. That really means power sharing. Anything else, I think, can only mean any other form of dealing seriously with the regime without, outside of the context of an agreement, means basically helping to destroy the opposition, and I think that would be very mistaken, not to mention wrong morally. The only other option, I think, for now, the sort of less politically costly option, which I've argued recently in an article, is to work with the regime's backers in Iran and Russia and with the opposition's other backers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, to engineer truces on the two sides. A total regime truce towards the opposition, total opposition truce towards the regime, with no other political strings attached. That is the sort of thing maybe that can be done without fundamentally undermining the opposition and fundamentally extending the regime's life. I should just add one thing, that it's tempting maybe to think that the regime would actually be able to take on ISIS if only the US sort of supported it or gave it that sort of political cover. The regime is very badly stretched, and it simply doesn't have the manpower and the means to go beyond its current lines, except incrementally. And therefore, the idea that somehow this is the one force on the ground that can transform everything is mistaken. So whether by political or by military standard, dealing with the Assad regime should not extend to anything beyond, I think, a no conditions attached unilateral truce on both sides.
Thank you so much, Yazid. With that, we come to the conclusion of this session. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.